The first time I heard them was during the midnight watch. I'd only been stationed at Cape Mercy Lighthouse for 3 weeks, taking over from old Harland, who'd kept the light for nearly 40 years before his arthritis forced retirement. That night a dense fog had rolled in from the bay, so thick I couldn't see the breaking waves below, though I could hear them crashing against the rocks. The foghorn sounded its regular interval, 15 seconds of warning, then 45 seconds of silence, a rhythm that had already become part of my unconscious counting. During one of those silent intervals I heard it, a voice, then another, then several, forming a haunting chorus that seemed to float through the fog itself. It wasn't singing exactly, more like calling with elongated vowels that rose and fell in pitch. The voices were distinctly feminine, but carried an otherworldly quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps fishing boats further out in the bay. But deep down I knew what I was hearing. Every lighthouse keeper along this coast had stories of the Sirens, though most dismissed them as legends meant to explain the tragically high number of shipwrecks along our treacherous shoreline. I radioed the Coast Guard to check if there were any vessels in distress. "Negative," came the reply. "All ships accounted for. Advise you maintain visual and audio watch due to poor visibility." The voices continued through the night, growing stronger as the tide reached its peak. I found myself drawn to the gallery outside, leaning over the railing, straining to see through the impenetrable grey. There was something mesmerizing about those calls, something that made me want to get closer, to find their source. At one point I caught myself halfway down the spiral staircase leading to the lower entrance, with no memory of having left my post. That frightened me more than the voices themselves. I hurried back up and locked the door behind me. By dawn the fog had thinned enough to reveal the bay below. The water appeared normal, empty save for a few fishing boats heading out for the morning catch, but at the base of the rocks where the waves had receded with the tide something gleamed. Later that day I climbed down the narrow path to the shore. Scattered across the wet sand and caught in crevices between rocks were dozens of unusual shells I'd never seen before, spiraled and iridescent with an interior that shimmered with colors that seemed to shift as you turned them in the light. I collected a few and brought them to Marina, the marine biologist who ran the small research station in town. Her eyes widened when she saw them. "Where did you find these?" she asked, examining one under her magnifying glass. "Below the lighthouse after last night's fog." She looked up sharply. "Did you hear anything unusual last night?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound like a superstitious fool. "Maybe. Some strange sounds carried by the fog." Marina's face paled slightly. She opened a drawer and pulled out a recording device. "Like this?" She pressed play and I felt a chill run through me. The same eerie calls I'd heard last night emerged from the tiny speaker. "I recorded this 3 years ago during a similar fog," she explained. "I was out on the research boat when we were suddenly surrounded. The fog was so dense we had to rely entirely on instruments to navigate. That's when we heard these sounds." "What are they?" I asked, though I already suspected her answer. "Officially, unknown marine mammals with a unique vocalization pattern," she said with careful precision. Then, lowering her voice, "Unofficially, the locals have always called them the Fogbound sisters. They appear only in the densest sea fogs, usually during the spring tides." Marina showed me her research, recordings, shell samples, and even blurry photographs taken by fishermen showing what appeared to be pale, elongated figures just beneath the water's surface, visible for only a moment before disappearing into the depths. "The strangest thing," she continued, "is what happens to electronic equipment when they're nearby. Compasses spin wildly, radios pick up impossible frequencies, and GPS systems show locations hundreds of miles away." That explained the shipwrecks, modern technology rendered useless just as the hypnotic quality of those voices clouded human judgment. "I've been at Cape Mercy for 3 years now. I've heard the sirens 12 more times, always during a heavy fog. I've learned to secure myself in the lighthouse during these episodes, to wear noise-cancelling headphones when their calls become too persuasive. Last month, after the worst storm in decades, we found a fresh shipwreck on the southern reefs. The vessel's log showed they'd been well off course, despite state-of-the-art navigation systems. The captain's final entry mentioned voices in the fog and coordinates that would have placed them in the middle of the Atlantic, not along our coastline. Marina's research continues, though funding agencies remain skeptical. The shells continue to appear after each foggy night when the voices are heard. And sometimes, when the moon is right and the tide is at its highest, I catch glimpses of them from the lighthouse gallery, pale figures cutting through the water with inhuman grace, vanishing beneath the waves whenever a beam of light finds them. I don't expect you to believe me, do you? Most visitors to Cape Mercy hear our stories and smile politely, attributing them to isolation and maritime tradition. But the next time you're on the water and a fog rolls in, thick enough to swallow all light and distance, listen carefully during those moments of silence. And if you hear them calling, turn your boat around and head for open water. No matter how beautiful their voices may be, no matter how much you want to find their source, row away as fast as you can.